Then let me introduce our today's speaker. Enzo, as I mentioned in the introduction, is part of the Non-Swiss Architects. And the Non-Swiss Architects, it's a collective of workers in architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, and planning, pushing for the improvement of working conditions, especially in Switzerland, for all. And through research and political activism, you report on forms of exploitation and discrimination inflicted on architectural workers. And your mission also includes equipping individuals and groups with tools for self-organization to resist the erosion of workers' rights. I'll now hand over to you, Enzo. I'm really looking forward to your input, and yeah, you're welcome to share your screen.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you everybody at Nature Plus for the invitation. Very happy to be participating in today's late lunch session. So I guess the first thing I should address is how come we are talking here today. We believe that an equitable future for the construction industry starts with equitable labor conditions, which is for us the relevant connection and the reason we chose to participate today. We think those two things come together. Environmental safeguarding in the architectural industry goes hand in hand with fair work conditions and a fair market in the end. So we are non-Swiss architects. I'm here representing the group today. We started in 2020 around the pandemic through a series of questionings that happened in small conversations that then turned into an Instagram page that slowly became a kind of a hotline and repository of complaints that were and feelings that were pent up within amongst all workers, and especially at that time, work conditions and the reality of employment during the pandemic, I mean, was at its most vulnerable. And that's also where the issues at workplace became the most noticeable, and the mainstream media, everyone was talking about it. So it's part of that movement as well. And we believe it's part of a general movement that was kicked off around that time that we started organizing ourselves. So as Barbara was introducing us, we are a group of workers in architecture in both the private sector and academia. And I would like to stress the fact that we refer to ourselves as architectural workers and not architects. We think we believe, or we defend that there's a difference between the two things. And most of us, and I believe a lot of the people listening in today, are architectural workers. They graduated as architects, they have a title, but their material reality, their professional reality is that of a worker. And that's an important distinction to be made right off. We are not alone. We're not the only ones doing that. We're not the first either. Here you're seeing just some of the groups that we are in contact with, that we know of, or that we've collaborated with. For example, Architectural Workers United in the US, that has been doing excellent unionizing work, and especially bringing into knowledge the conditions of work in the US, which are particularly vulnerable without the safety nets that implemented through lawmaking that we have, for example, in the European continent more, but which are also slowly being questioned, which is a dangerous thing. We have the section of architectural workers that's from the UK. They've also recently unionized and are conducting very relevant work also with RIBA, the representative body for architects in the UK. We have NAA, that's Netherlands Angry Architects. We're in contact with them currently, and the name says it all. They're upset. The Netherlands is also a hotspot for migrant work that attracts a lot of architects, especially neo graduates. And so you have a huge mass of international workers in a very small market. at least internally speaking, but a very famous kind of architectural production that is exported and has been made famous through, for example, works as offices such as OMA. So you have a lot of foreigners in that sector, and they have a lot of similar complaints and demands that we non-Swiss architects have, which I will tell you more about. We have Future Architect Fronts that is also UK based, and it's kind of like a discussion forum for the changes that are necessary, the problems that are so widespread and that must be addressed. Up top, we have writers as well conducting work. So this is slowly making its way into theory. So there's new propositions coming up, analysis. That's something we're very interested in, and we try to keep it at all times present while we conduct our work. So Marisa Kortreich, for example, has written a number of articles and published a book recently. That's the one you're seeing here. This one, Can This Be? Surely This Cannot Be, Architectural Workers Organizing in Europe. I highly recommend it. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is inspired and references that work. Recently, we've come into contact, last person on the last group on the screen, we've come into contact with Archi en Colère, so that's upset architects in the French-speaking parts of Switzerland who are also struggling with different kinds of issues. Switzerland, which is the locus from which I'm speaking, on which we do work, also has very distinct problems depending on what area you're in. So I'm going to talk more about them later, but there's struggles that the French parts are going through that the German or the Italian parts have not necessarily come to yet or do not necessarily share. So discrimination, what are we talking about here? There's many ways we can address that, not only through labor, but also specifically today, yes. For example, foreigners, we are non-Swiss architects. For those who don't know, swissarchitects.com or .ch maybe is a very famous platform for job search in the Swiss environment. The group names itself kind of like parodying that because, for example, in cities like Zurich, 50% of the workforce is actually foreign. So that's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek provocation, although the platform is very good for finding a job. I do recommend it in that sense. So foreigners, and that's an official statistic you're seeing here. Foreigners in Switzerland do claim to have felt discrimination 1 in 4 times. So 1 foreigner in 4 claims to have felt discrimination while searching for a job. And that gets even worse because at the job, 1 in 3 persons has said that they have felt discriminated against. And you can see it at the bottom, it says rassistische Diskriminierung in der Schweiz. So we're talking specifically about race. Also, as a side note, we were first invited to talk about discrimination in the entire industry, including the construction site, which is something we discussed. We're not well equipped to talk about, but these numbers that are not focusing exclusively in the architectural sector, but that also encompass the construction sector, also show a warning scenario where 30% of workers with a foreign background, let's not even talk about second generation migrants that suffered a different kind of discrimination. These people are seriously and recurrently going through problems at the workplace. And this also translates into the housing market, for example, which in the end, housing composes most of what architecture and the real estate development industry does. That has everything to do with what we do. The policies that are decided outside of the architectural office will ultimately impact the work we're doing, most of it being housing. In Switzerland, particularly, Swiss residents, that's a research that was conducted recently by official government bodies, shows that foreign-sounding names, especially here, you get populations from decades ago coming from different parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, and other areas that get discriminated against when applying for housing solely on the basis of how their name sounds. And so as you see, this is much more widespread than simply being discriminated against when you're looking for a job. So the thing with understanding discrimination, which can be race-based, but can also be based on many other things. In Switzerland, for example, when in the architectural industry, but any other industry, language is a big discrimination aspect when applying for jobs, negotiating raises or negotiating your first salary. The problem with mapping discrimination is that you have to do the research first before you can address it. In Switzerland, similarly to the RIBA in the UK, or other institutions such as Ordre des Architectes or Ordine degli Architetti, the SEA has conducted up until 2017 surveys aimed at showing the status of the conditions of work and architectural offices in Switzerland. That work has stopped in 2017, and it was a very informative piece that made the distinction between male and female workers, which is a very important discrimination form of discrimination. But at that time, the last 2017, the last study that they put out did not address in any way, shape, or form how discrimination is also based on other things, namely, for example, race. So into 2020, the group Non-Swiss Architects starts as a sort of venting platform on Instagram, and so many stories start repeating themselves, and so many people have gone through the same thing. So at that point, where the group decides, okay, we need to conduct something a more formal form of research. Of course, the testimonies, how we call them, these pieces of these stories that everybody has heard from people around them in the architectural industry of the bad things that can happen. These are all valuable, but some sort of statistical approach or more, let's say, scientific approach to quantifying and to mapping how these things are happening is necessary. The problem is currently public organizations, namely the SEA, which should be responsible for that, does not do it. They're on hold. They said that the next survey would come in 2024, end of it. We're in the end of it. We haven't seen anything yet, so we're skeptical if it's going to come out. In 2020, we started doing our own because no one was doing it. So, I mean, the slide has been on for a while. Here you can see in 2021, 85% of people said they had felt some sort of that foreigners go through some sort of discrimination in the architecture sector. At that time, we also asked the question about how much money are you making? So here again, we can see the gender gap, and the gender and the nationality gap, where a male Swiss employee will be making almost 2,000 francs more than a female foreigner in Switzerland, which is an absurd gap. Unfortunately, also not surprising. This is mirroring trends where women's salaries the gap has diminished, but it's still quite present. And the more you climb onto the hierarchy of any industry, any office in any industry, the bigger that gap remains. Look, for example, how many of the 10 billion richest billionaires, there's one woman. It's not the best example, but it represents the problem at the top of the accumulation pyramid. But that's also the case in any office. Look around and you see how often female partners make it to that position, especially in male-dominated offices. And then the next question at that time was, okay, so and this is a very subjective question. What reasons can you think of for the salary gap? This cannot be quantified in objective terms. This remains subjective interpretation from the respondents. But look at the three most answered reasons for why there might be a salary gap. The language skill, as I mentioned before, which is important and must be acknowledged. Language is a skill. Professionally, your ability to collaborate diminishes if you're not able to fully collaborate in a language, but it can also be used in unfair ways when negotiating salaries. And that's something our testimonies show, that non-German speakers, for example, in the German-speaking parts of Switzerland, will suffer with negotiations, will be told that their language skills is the reason they're being paid perhaps 1,000 francs less than their colleague next to them. Next, nationality, as we were talking about, and gender. So what I had just mentioned, these three things are, again, unsurprising, and they show a panorama that is problematic and has not been addressed by statistics locally in the industry, in the architectural industry, and globally in the Swiss industry. And I could also make the step and say generally in Europe. So At that time, in 2021, we start collecting testimonies. These are just some of them. As you see, people started reaching out and telling us um, stories about their experiences in Switzerland, and you start seeing very abhorrent things where interns graduate and are kept in an intern position for 6 months or 1 year, being told that the fact that they do not yet have a specific level in German, whatever definition that may be, is a reason for them not being employed, which is actually illegal. You have salary gaps that are very difficult to uncover because there is no law that demands transparency in salaries in Switzerland, at least. I know that's the case in other places. And so, as you see here, people started reaching out to us. And slowly we became this kind of like, as I said before, kind of like a hotline, a helpline for workers in Switzerland struggling with contractual negotiations, but also with illegalities that kept happening to them. Recently, we've been told of someone who had been asked for a salary had been demanded to accept a salary reduction subjectively based on performance grounds, and that is simply abhorrent. That person happened to be a foreigner, which puts them in a very difficult position where you're holding a job visa, you're holding a permit, and if you lose a job, you have a limited amount of time to stay in the country, or you get sent back or kicked out, which is I mean, these are architects, these are people with higher education, somehow the expectation of job stability, but that treatment is not so different from the realities of, like, for example, Gastarbeit, where stay in a place was attached to employment and the ability to provide labor, and that's where things start getting quite upsetting. So we consolidated ourselves in 2021 as these mappers of inequality, as this repository for shared experiences, and we started putting them together into more quantifiable, graspable forms. Because if you don't recognize the problem, if you cannot give it a shape, you cannot really address it or talk about it. So that's been the core of our work. It has been to bring to attention, to bring into the fore that these experiences that a lot of us have gone through, either as nationals or as foreigners, exploitation does not happen only towards foreigners, that these things that happen to us happen systematically, and that making them known, making these experiences shared, is a form of gaining the ability to act on them. So in 2023, we conducted another one. And we've started refining our questions. We also increased the number of participants, which over time we hope will qualify it to become even of a statistical relevance. Right now, it is statistically relevant, but our hopes is that we can at some point reach 5% of the workforce in Switzerland, which is around 50,000 architects, I believe, in 2022. So here again, we ask the same question. Have you ever experienced forms of discrimination in a Swiss working environment, that meaning architectural offices or in landscape offices? And over half of people say they have. And here we don't ask on what base. Then we do a cross analysis. So how many women say that they have felt it? And that's over 70% of women compared to less than 50% of men. Again, not surprising, but disappointing. And then again, if we separate the responses by nationality, we see that foreigners feel way more subjected to discrimination inside an office than Swiss nationals, for example. And that does correspond to our findings through testimonies, where foreigners, especially in junior positions, so lower in their career, like earlier in their careers, are most often assigned to competitions, which are very demanding departments in any architectural office. They are sometimes asked to to forego compensation. That means accepting that they cannot claim over hours. They accept lower pay as well. They are offered lower pay, sometimes barely on the threshold of a minimum salary. That's We have plenty of those stories. So these questionnaires, this collection of data is meant to illustrate in numbers what we and everyone perceives through subjective testimonies and simply the conversation that goes around. So we're not the only ones, as I said before, doing that. People around us in the European continent, but also abroad, have been doing things. For example, as I said before, the section of architectural workers unionized recently. That means they became the section for architectural workers within a bigger union structure in the UK, and they have managed to, through that, and as part of that effort, they have also become politically relevant. Recently, a couple of years ago, they supported someone's candidacy for the presidency of the RIBA. They are not a political party. They simply put out that candidate's points and the things that that person was backing, and they offered political support. And the platform of that candidate was to make reforms, to begin reforms in the RIBA, which is traditionally a very elitist, centralized institution. The idea was to start implementing reforms that had the workers' interests in mind. In Portugal, Sintarc has recently also acquired, become a union, and they're conducting amazing work in Portugal. Architectural Workers United in the US are also in this unionization process, in this effort, and they are supporting, for example, that depends on each country's structure and how union rights or unionization rights are formed. But there, for example, they serve as mediators and as informers and provide assistance to collective groups. That means colleagues, workers in the same company that want to unionize, and they provide the framework and help these people achieve it. And they also do conduct some kind of journalism and bring to knowledge cases of malpractice. Also in Switzerland, things are happening, albeit at a different pace. As with Switzerland's democratic system, things tend to go a bit slower. We have in Basel, for example, recently a movement to implement a collective bargaining agreement that is a Gesamtarbeitsvertrag. That means one contract that applies for the entire sector, for any employer-employee relationship that has subscribed to those terms. Usually, that is enforced by the patronal institution, in that case being the SEA, and backed up by a union who is representing the sides of the workers. They are also then enforced by the state. So Basel, Canton Basel, where so many offices are set and so many very famous ones is now in developing that, gathering signatures and formulating, negotiating. In the end, it's a very political activity to establish these things. They're in that process right now. Canton Genève, I mentioned before, Archi en Colère, so the upset architects of Genève, they are in a couple steps ahead. They have a collective bargaining agreement that was in place for a couple of years already, a couple decades, that had become outdated, which is also a problem that can happen sometimes. Things are decided in the 90s and then don't get updated, and that has to do with lawmaking, how well a contract is written. They have recently gone into campaigning because basically because of union wars happening, where a collective bargaining agreement gets shut down, and then a new one gets proposed, but there was no polling amongst workers. That was an exclusive decision made by two representative parties. But the workers do have the possibility to deny that, so they have now started campaigning against that to demand actual polling, actual understanding of the conditions in the canton, so that a new draft for a collective bargaining agreement can be made that takes into consideration, for example, the fact that in the last years, rent in Canton Genève, especially in the metropolitan area, has risen by 40%, while salaries have risen by 10%. Not accounting for inflation even. So these are things that a collective bargaining agreement should encompass, mechanisms that take into consideration the fact that most cities, especially in Switzerland where labor is available, have gone through extreme rent rises in the last years that must be taken into consideration. Otherwise, year by year, you're not getting a salary increase, you're getting a salary decrease merely by inflation plus rent, which is a serious problem everywhere. As we're all aware, the media keeps talking about it in both sides of the Atlantic. Canton Vaud in 2019 made their own collective bargaining agreement, which, for example, has increased maternity leave for mothers, has ensured 25 weeks of days of holiday, which is not the legal minimum. The minimum in Switzerland is 20, but many industries have already made that shift to 25. Architecture, a very conservative part of a very conservative industry, is lagging behind, but they managed in this particular canton to implement more days of holidays. Amongst other securities, for example, if inflation goes above a certain threshold for a year, that automatically triggers new salary negotiations and readjustments, which is not contemplated by normal work law, but has been agreed collectively by employers and employees, mediated by associations. So that's a huge win for workers in that part of Switzerland. And we hope that Basel gets it too. And we non-Swiss architects would be delighted to participate in the implementation of that same fight in Canton Zurich, where so many architects, especially foreigners, are. But what are the challenges? It's not that easy, and things do take a long time. Simply negotiation takes a lot of time. These drafts usually don't happen overnight. But there's also cultural and social barriers to that. For example, I mentioned before Marisa Kortwright's work. I recommend the article down here, Death to the Calling, a job in architecture is still a job, which I think is a very good axiom. I think that's true. She says the literary archetype of the hero's quest primes a similar contemporary myth, a calling. What does that mean? That the conversation around labor, around architecture as work, oftentimes doesn't happen because we come out of architecture school under the assumption that we're all following a calling to become architects. And right at the beginning, I mentioned we are workers in architecture. We consider ourselves to be workers foremost, later architects. Sometimes I personally feel like I'm an architect, but most of the time I am a worker. But that conversation does not happen while everyone is convinced that they're single-handedly responsible for their success as an architect, which is unfortunately part of atelier culture and something that is also transmitted to students in academia, that we're better off alone. That hinders even the simple conversation as asking each other, hey, how much are you earning? How much did you get offered? Because that would sometimes be that is very often considered to be beneath what we're doing, which is art or something bigger. The reality is, for most of us, we're going to be workers of all of our lives. And to deny that fact in pursuit of a calling, that is to become a great architect, not that that's not possible as a worker, that is possible, specifically when you accept that. Well, if you insist on that while still expecting a paycheck every month for the next 40, 50 years, that's not a very easy conversation to have. And well, something else to blame is neoliberalism and the fact that today 10% of architects in Switzerland, of workers actually overall in Switzerland, are unionized. And in the 1970s, that number was closer to 25%. That means, and in gross numbers, there's less people unionized today, around 700,000 people, than in the 1970s, which were 800 people for around 3 million workers. Now we're 5.5 million. So this is just a sign, a consequence of decades of the failure both of union work, of unionizing efforts to convince and to adapt, to convince workers that that work is necessary, and also to adapt to the realities of migration of 21st century economics that make work different than what it was in the 70s and 80s. And we all know that. We don't, careers don't develop the same way they did 40, 50 years ago. And as a consequence, interest in collective efforts has also waned. And people seem to assume very often that they're better off trying to negotiate alone. But every study, every statistic analysis will always show that collective bargaining, that is negotiating together, it can be 5 people that agree that they're going to talk to their bosses together, or 20,000 workers that go on strike or decide to make pressure towards their representative party, for example, the SCA or RIBA or the Ordine. This will always yield more fruit, bear more fruits. And ultimately, what I would like to finish with is that architecture is labor. It begins with labor, it ends with labor in every part of the process. And fair labor is one of the founding stones of fair architecture, and that also means as sustainable architecture. Sustainability is not only green materials, gray energy, and less CO2. Fairness, equity in the construction industry also means access to resources of the material kind, but also of the financial kind. So a fair industry that treats their workers fairly, with equity, with dignity, most of all, is better able to face the challenges of the 21st century, that the very real material challenges of transitioning into a green economy, transitioning into a net zero construction industry, a impoverished, destabilized workforce, which in the end are the everyday decision makers, the ones that are creating architecture, is not able to fight those things. And neither is an office owner able to change these things if their collective, their sector, so all architects, the body of all workers in architecture, cannot offer political pressure to make change. Hence, we find it very adequate to be talking here today, because labor fairness translates to environmental resource fairness, which is the ultimate goal. Thank you.